The opening shot of the movie Castaway is a lonely road in the middle of an empty plain, a clue that the story you're about to be told is a lonely one. This film has the unique distinction of focusing almost exclusively on one character who spends the majority of the film's runtime completely isolated on a desert island. It's a fascinating idea for a movie, but it presents a big challenge. How do you craft a story with action, tension, and conflict if there's only one character primarily on screen? Enter Wilson, the inanimate volleyball, who I would argue is one of the most fascinating characters in film history. In this video, we'll look at how and why Wilson was written into this story and what he has to teach us about character writing in general. So let's get into it on The Art of Storytelling. If you had to boil down the main theme of Castaway into one word, I'd say it's about time. The first words of dialogue we hear from Chuck Noland, played by Tom Hanks, are, "Time rules over us without mercy. Like a fire, it can either destroy us or keep us warm." Nice little bit of foreshadowing there. His character is diligently punctual and warns his employees about the sin of losing track of time. But in his relationship with his girlfriend Kelly, played by Helen Hunt, he's running out of time. His busy schedule means he's unavailable and has delayed proposing to her, despite the fact that he's madly in love with her. Just before he boards his fateful flight, she gives him a pocket watch, which he promises to keep on Memphis time. He then boards the plane, saying to Kelly,
"I'll be right back."
And after an absolutely harrowing plane crash scene, Chuck winds up stranded on a desert island in the South Pacific, along with a few FedEx packages that have washed up on the shore. And what follows is a vivid portrait of survival, both physically and psychologically. Things soon go very badly for Chuck. He suffers several injuries and fails in his first attempt to escape the island, which is surrounded by an impassable reef. He eventually opens the packages and discovers some useful items. Among these, there happens to be a Wilson Sporting Good volleyball. By the way, the film's writer, William Broyles Jr., researched this story by isolating himself on a beach for a week, and he got the idea for Wilson when a volleyball washed up on shore. So while trying to start a fire, Chuck cuts his hand open and, in a fit of rage, throws the ball with his bloody hand, creating the now famous handprint. According to Tom Hanks, it was important to the director, Robert Zemeckis, that Wilson be made from Chuck's own blood, which is kind of interesting. Chuck gives him a face, and this is how Wilson, as we know him, is born. Now, what I'd really like to explore in this video is what makes him a character exactly. I think most people feel intuitively that he is a character, but why? It's interesting to consider that the projection of human qualities onto non-human things is perhaps the most ancient device in the history of storytelling. Anthropomorphism appears to be an evolutionary instinct in humans. It's not just a cultural phenomenon, it's actually fundamental to cognition. A rustling of leaves in a dark forest might be a predator, or it might be nothing, but there's a survival advantage in imagining that it is a predator, and that means we tend to see things in nature that aren't there. And this partially explains why humans have such a long history of ascribing agency to non-human things. The sun watches over us, the sea is angry, the wind brings good fortune. Agency is the soul of character. A volcano that erupts for no reason is just a volcano, but a volcano that erupts because it's angry is a character. So with that in mind, let's look at whether Wilson has any agency in the story. And well, the first time Chuck speaks to Wilson is when he's trying to start a fire.
You wouldn't match by a chance, would you?
And in this instant, the fire Chuck was struggling to start begins to smolder. Look closely at how this sequence is cut. Notice Chuck's reaction to Wilson. I think the suggestion of this sequence is that Chuck believes Wilson is responsible for conjuring the fire. You could interpret this as Chuck losing his mind and becoming superstitious, or you could interpret it as something more metaphysical. Either way, the critical point is that Wilson appears to influence the events of the story, and that is the precise moment that this inanimate volleyball becomes a character. Now, I can't make a video about Castaway without mentioning its epic 4-year time skip, giving us one of the most dramatic character transformations in movie history. They actually halted production for an entire year so that Tom Hanks could grow a beard and lose 50 pounds. And in that time, Robert Zemeckis actually edited the first half of the film, so they were in the extremely rare position of being able to rewrite a lot of the second half based on the cut of the first half. And one thing they definitely leaned into is Chuck's relationship with Wilson, who has also visibly aged. This section of the story has a lot of dialogue scenes between Chuck and Wilson, usually with Wilson sitting silently on a stump. Some of their dialogue is shot reverse shot, just like you'd expect in any other dialogue scene, and it's really the editing that reinforces the idea that Wilson has agency in the story. One magical power of the medium of film is the ability to suggest agency or intent merely by blocking a scene a certain way or framing a subject in a certain way. Obviously, Chuck's reactions are the focus of the scene, but that doesn't mean Wilson isn't also being characterized. The audience can clearly see that Chuck and Wilson have a kind of codependent relationship. Wilson gives voice to the part of Chuck's psyche that doubts himself, and Chuck, in turn, resents Wilson, while also tragically depending on him. But through it all, you get the sense that they're close companions. Wilson isn't the only symbolically important object in the story. In some ways, this film is about our relationship to objects and the mundane comforts of normal life. Actually, the first thing that happens when Chuck washes up on the island is that the pocket watch Kelly gave him stops working. Time, the thing that defines Chuck, has abandoned him, and he has to devise new ways of measuring it. Later, he finds a flashlight that helps him in his early attempts to escape the island, and when the battery at last runs out, it functions beautifully as an illustration of Chuck's hope growing more and more dim. The other important object in the story is the only package that he chooses not to open because it has wings painted on it. It represents his hope that he may one day leave the island and deliver it. He also paints these wings on the makeshift sail that ultimately gets him off the island. These symbolic objects are important narrative guideposts for the viewer who might otherwise have no means of accessing Chuck's inner thoughts and feelings. But thanks to these symbolic objects, by the time Chuck has built his raft and escaped the island, the viewer clearly knows what he's thinking and feeling. And this really pays off when Chuck reaches what I think is his lowest point in the story. And that's, of course, Wilson's famous death scene. It begins with Wilson accidentally coming loose from his perch and falling rather unceremoniously into the ocean. Although if we grant that Wilson is a character with agency, it does kind of feel like Wilson chooses to leave Chuck of his own accord. He floats away very slowly before Chuck realizes what's happening and tries to save him. It's an absolutely heartbreaking scene as Chuck realizes that if he goes after Wilson, he'll lose the raft.
Wilson, I'm sorry! I'm sorry! Wilson! I can't!
He makes the choice to live, a critical turning point for a character we know has considered death as a means of escaping the island. But this decision means he must abandon Wilson to his fate on the open seas. It's kind of interesting to reflect on your own emotions when you watch this scene and ask yourself whether you're more sad for Chuck or for Wilson, or whether the distinction between characters even matters. By the way, shout out to Alan Silvestri's beautiful score in this scene, which is notable not only for its brilliant simplicity, but also because it's one of the only times you hear music in the film. In fact, there's absolutely no musical score the entire time Chuck is on the island. It isn't until Chuck succeeds in leaving the island that you hear the score for the first time. As we find out in the story's conclusion, this isn't a story with a happy ending. Ultimately, Chuck makes it home, only to find that Kelly is married and has a daughter. It's a bittersweet ending, but this story couldn't end any other way. Sometimes the character goes so far that they simply can't go back. And there is actually one last reference to Wilson in the film as Chuck heads to deliver the unopened package. It's a sentimental nod to our beloved volleyball, who, by the way, was such a popular character that he won the Critics' Choice Award for Best Inanimate Object in 2001. He's also still available for purchase from Wilson Sporting Goods, whose brand became synonymous with the character, and who, of course, embraced the character as a marketing opportunity. And no, that's not a sponsorship. The original prop actually recently sold at auction for over $300,000, which just goes to show you how enduring Wilson's cultural impact really is. But I think Wilson's biggest legacy, especially for anyone interested in writing characters for film, is that characters aren't only a product of dialogue and acting. Obviously, Tom Hanks deserves major credit for being the emotional core of this film, but a lot of what you feel in this movie comes purely from the expressive potential of the medium itself. It's filmed in such a way that Wilson feels like he has agency and therefore feels like a real person. And that means his death scene resonates with anyone who has ever experienced any kind of grief, loss, abandonment, or loneliness. And I think the big insight here about characters is that the audience participates in creating them. We put ourselves into the characters in a story just as much as the author does. And that's why even an inanimate object can contain some essence of what it means to be human. So thanks for watching. Check out my Patreon if you'd like to support the channel, and I'll see you on the next one.